She didn't know his name. She didn't know his fortune. All Elizabeth Carter knew was that a man was sitting alone in the mud outside a church, his expensive coat soaked through his shoulders, shaking like a boy who had lost everything, and not a single soul had stopped for him. So she knelt down beside him in the dirt, wrapped her arms around a stranger, and held on. That was the moment everything changed. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel, follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can travel. Kentucky, 1801 Fenton. The church bells had gone silent 20 minutes ago. The white ribbons tied to the oak tree out front were already starting to curl in the damp morning air. The wooden steps of the Lexington First Church still held scattered flower petals. Someone had swept most of them aside in a hurry. The wedding guests were gone. The carriages had rolled away one by one, carrying with them whispers and sideways glances and barely concealed smiles, the kind that polite society always tried to hide but never quite managed. And outside on the wet stone path that curved around the side of the church toward the road, a man sat alone. He was not sitting the way a man sits when he is resting. He was sitting the way a man sits when his legs have given out beneath him and there is simply nowhere left to go. His coat was one of the finest Elizabeth Carter had ever seen. Dark wool brass buttons, the kind of coat that announced money before a man even opened his mouth. His boots were hand-stitched. His cravat, though now loosened and twisted, was silk. Everything about him declared that he was not a man accustomed to sitting in the mud. And yet there he was. His face was hidden in both hands. His shoulders were moving in a way that no grown man wanted anyone to witness. He was not making much sound, which somehow made it worse. It was the silent kind of grief, the kind that had already gone past crying out loud and settled into something heavier. Elizabeth stopped walking. She had been on her way back from Mrs. Pruitt's house on the other side of town, a commission for 3 summer dresses that had kept her sewing by candlelight for the better part of 2 weeks. The dresses were folded carefully in the wooden box she carried under her arm. Too carefully, she always thought, for work that paid so little. She had been thinking about her mother, about the rent, about the bolt of blue wool she needed to buy before the end of the month, and whether there was going to be any money left over after she paid it. She had not been thinking about stopping. 3 other people had already passed the man on the stone path. She had watched them from 20 yards away. A woman in a yellow bonnet who glanced at him, then looked quickly ahead and walked faster. 2 men in good coats who exchanged a look and simply steered around him without breaking their conversation. Elizabeth was not wealthy. She was not powerful. She had no title and no family name that opened doors. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a seamstress who had died 2 winters ago, leaving nothing behind but a small house, a sewing table, a handful of debts, and a daughter who had learned to work without complaint. She had every reason in the world to keep walking. She told herself exactly that. Keep walking, Lizzie. He's not your concern. A man like that has people. He has family. He has servants and lawyers and friends with influence. He doesn't need anything from a girl carrying a box of dresses down a muddy road. She took 2 more steps. Then she stopped again, because she had looked at his hands. His hands were pressed so hard against his face that his knuckles had gone white. And there was something about that image, a man holding himself together with nothing but his own 2 hands, that Elizabeth Carter simply could not walk past. She set her box down against the church wall. She crossed the path, and she knelt down beside him in the mud without saying a single word. She didn't reach for his arm. She didn't say something careful and polished the way people did when they were performing kindness for an audience. She simply put her hand on his back, and then, because it seemed like the only honest thing to do, she put her arms around him and held on. He went rigid for a moment, the way people do when they haven't been touched kindly in a long time, and their body doesn't quite know how to receive it. Then something in him broke open. He didn't speak. Neither did she. She just held him there on the wet stone path outside the church while the morning moved around them, and she let him be a man who was falling apart, because sometimes that was the only thing another person could offer, and it was enough. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that his name was Nathaniel Whitmore, or that the Whitmore name was known in every county courthouse from Lexington to Louisville, or that the woman who had failed to appear at the altar this morning, had been Clara Beaumont, daughter of Senator James Beaumont of Virginia, or that the wedding itself had been 3 years in the making and had been talked about in parlors and drawing rooms across 2 states as the most significant match in Kentucky society in a decade. She didn't know any of that. All she knew was that someone was hurting, and she had stopped. She was still holding him when he finally spoke. His voice came out rough and low like a man who had been clenching his jaw for hours. "You don't know me." "No," Elizabeth said quietly. "I don't." A pause. She felt his breathing slow slightly. "Then why are you—" He stopped. Started again. "Why did you stop?" Elizabeth thought about it for a moment. She was not the kind of woman who gave easy answers to hard questions. "Because everybody else didn't," she said. I was quiet for a long time after that. When he finally lifted his face from his hands and looked at her, she saw that he was perhaps 35. His face was the kind that would normally be described as composed, strong jaw, dark eyes, the sort of features that sat naturally in authority. Right now, those features looked like a building after a storm. Something had passed through him and left marks. He looked at her the way people look when they are trying to figure out whether they are being mocked. "You're going to ruin your dress," he said finally. Elizabeth glanced down at the mud soaking into the hem of her skirt. "This dress has survived worse," she said. "So have I." Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something. "Nathaniel Whitmore," he said, like the name cost him something to say out loud. Elizabeth nodded once. "Elizabeth Carter. People call me Lizzie." "You're not from one of the families," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. "My father was a carpenter," she said. "My mother was a seamstress. I am also a seamstress. There's no family name worth mentioning." He looked at her for another moment, then looked away toward the road. "My bride," he said slowly, "did not come." "I know," Elizabeth said. "I heard the bells stop. Half of Kentucky heard the bells stop." His voice had gone flat. "They'll be talking about it before noon. By tomorrow it'll be in Virginia." He exhaled. "She just didn't come. No letter, no word, nothing. Her family says they don't know where she is." He said it without inflection, the way people recite facts that are too large to feel yet. 3 years. 3 years I courted her, waited for her, arranged everything. And this morning, I stood at that altar for 40 minutes, waiting for a woman who had already decided. He stopped himself. His jaw worked silently for a moment. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said, "because she was. That's a cruelty what was done to you, whatever the reason." He looked at her sharply when she said that, as if he hadn't expected her to say something true. "You don't know the reason," he said carefully. "No." Elizabeth agreed. "I don't." There was a pause between them, and something moved in the silence that Elizabeth couldn't quite name. Something that felt like the space before a question that hadn't been asked yet. She stood up slowly, brushing mud from her skirt. "You should go somewhere warm," she said. "You've been sitting in the cold long enough." He looked up at her from the ground, this wealthy, broken man, and for a moment he looked almost young. "Miss Carter," he said. She had already started back toward her box. "Yes?" He seemed to search for what he wanted to say, settled finally on, "Thank you." Elizabeth picked up her box, gave him a short nod. "Don't thank me. Just get up off the ground." She heard as she walked away the sound of him pulling himself to his feet. She did not think about Nathaniel Whitmore again that day. She thought about him the next morning briefly, when she passed the church road and remembered the mud. She thought, "I hope he found somewhere warm." And then she went back to thinking about the blue wool and the rent. She did not know that he had spent that evening sitting alone in the great house on Whitmore Road while his housekeeper tried to get him to eat something, and his estate manager, Mr. Graves, hovered in the doorway with a stack of correspondence and a carefully neutral expression. She did not know that he had sent everyone away eventually, and sat by a fire that burned down to ash while he stared at nothing. She did not know that sometime around midnight he had thought about a girl kneeling in the mud beside a stranger and something in him had wondered for the first time in years what it meant to do something simply because it was right, with nothing to gain from it. She didn't know any of that. She was at home by her own small fire, her needle moving through a hem in the lamplight, her mind on the work. 3 days later, a man appeared at the door of Elizabeth Carter's workroom. He was not Nathaniel Whitmore. He was a shorter man with sharp eyes and a coat that was good, but not exceptional. The coat of a man who served someone wealthy, rather than being wealthy himself. He introduced himself as Mr. Gerald Graves, estate manager for the Whitmore household. "Mr. Whitmore wishes to offer you a commission," Graves said, standing in the doorway of her workroom as if the smallness of the space offended him slightly. Elizabeth kept her needle moving. "I don't do men's tailoring." "It is not men's tailoring he requires. He has a widowed aunt arriving from Philadelphia next month. He has been advised that she will require several appropriate gowns for a Kentucky climate. He was told you are the finest seamstress in Lexington." Elizabeth looked up at him then. "He was told that was he. By Mrs. Pruitt, among others." Elizabeth set her work down. She considered for a moment. The commission would be significant, a wealthy household's guest multiple gowns. It would cover the wool and more. It might buy her 3 months of breathing room. "Tell Mr. Whitmore I accept," she said. Graves nodded, started to go. "Mr. Graves?" He turned. "Is your employer well?" she asked simply. Something flickered in the estate manager's face. Very brief, very professional. "He is managing," Graves said. Elizabeth nodded. "Good," she said, and picked up her needle again. She went to Whitmore House 2 days later to take measurements and discuss fabrics. The house was large and well-kept and deeply quiet, in the way that houses are quiet when only one person lives in them. A housekeeper named Mrs. Hollis showed her in and offered her tea in a sitting room that had more furniture than Elizabeth's entire cottage. She expected to deal with Graves, or possibly the aunt via letter. She did not expect Nathaniel Whitmore to walk into the room himself. He had collected himself considerably since the church path. He was dressed properly. His face had been shaved. He carried himself with the ease of a man who had grown up moving through rooms like this one. But when he saw Elizabeth, something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, a brief loosening like a knot that had been pulled too tight, finally giving slightly. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." She set down her tea, stood. He gestured for her to remain seated. "Please. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to offer my thanks in person. For the commission. And for—" he paused. "For the other day." "You already thanked me," Elizabeth said. "I know." He sat down across from her, which surprised her slightly. Men of his position didn't usually sit down with seamstresses to chat. "I wanted to do it again with better composure." Despite herself. Elizabeth almost smiled. "You had reasonable composure," she said, "given the circumstances." "I was sitting in the mud weeping." "Yes, that was the reasonable part." He looked at her, and this time something did cross his face that was recognizably a smile, though a thin and bruised one. "You're very direct, Miss Carter," he said. "I am," she agreed. "My mother always said it was my greatest flaw." "I disagree with your mother." He said it without any sense of flirtation, just plainly the way someone states a fact. "It's refreshing. Most people who have spoken to me this past week have been telling me things they think I want to hear." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "What do they say? That it was for the best, that Clara was never right for me, that I dodged a bullet, as the saying goes." He said it all with a careful blankness. "What they mean is that they are relieved the spectacle is over so they can go back to their own business." "And what do you say?" He was quiet for a moment. "I say I don't understand what happened," he said finally. "I say I had no idea. I say I thought I knew her, and apparently I didn't know her at all. And I don't know whether to be angry or to feel that somehow I failed her." Elizabeth said nothing for a moment. "Mr. Whitmore," she said at last, "can I ask you something honest?" He nodded. "In 3 years of courting Miss Beaumont, did you ever ask her what she was afraid of?" He looked at her. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said quickly. "That was too forward, I shouldn't." "No." He held up one hand. "No, don't apologize." He sat with the question for a long moment. Then quietly, "No," he said. "I don't believe I did." The silence in the room was the thoughtful kind. "You couldn't have known what you didn't ask," Elizabeth said carefully. "That's not the same as failing her." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It was the look of a man encountering something unfamiliar and finding it unexpectedly useful. "You knew her," he said suddenly. "You were her seamstress, weren't you? I heard you made her gown." Elizabeth went still. Not much, just a fraction. "I made her gown," she said. His eyes were on her face. He was sharp, she realized. Whatever the past weeks had done to him, they hadn't dulled that. "Is there something you know, Miss Carter?" The question was quiet. It was not threatening. It was simply the question of a man who had been trying to understand something for days, and recognized suddenly that the answer might be in the room with him. Elizabeth looked down at her hands. She thought about Clara Beaumont, who had stood very still in this fitting room 3 months ago, while Elizabeth pinned the hem of a wedding gown, who had not said a word, who had stared at the window with a face that Elizabeth had tried not to look at directly, because the expression on it was not the expression a bride was supposed to have. She thought about what she had noticed, what she had written in her small ledger, because Elizabeth Carter wrote everything down: measurements, details, dates, changes. She wrote things down, not because she expected them to matter, but because her mother had taught her that a woman who kept careful records had something to stand on. She thought about Thomas Beaumont, whose name she had heard said by a housemaid, in a way that made something go cold in her chest. She looked up at Nathaniel Whitmore. "I need to think," she said, "about what I know and what I'm able to say." He nodded slowly. "I understand." She could see that he did understand, which was somehow the most surprising thing about him. "I'll have the measurements for your aunt done by Thursday," she said. And she stood, and she gathered her things, and she did not let her hands shake until she was back outside in the cold air and out of sight of Whitmore House. She was halfway home before she let herself stop walking. She stood at the corner of Market Street and 2nd Avenue, the box under her arm, the cold November air cutting through her shawl, and she let herself think about the things she had been carefully not thinking about for 3 months. Clara Beaumont had come in for her first fitting in August. She had been beautiful and composed, and exactly what people expected the daughter of Senator Beaumont to be. She had made small talk and been gracious and held her arms out at the correct angles. By September, she had stopped talking altogether during the fittings. In October, Elizabeth had arrived at the Beaumont house early, a key left under the mat, a standing invitation, and found Clara sitting in the fitting room before she got there already, dressed already, waiting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the wall, with an expression that Elizabeth recognized with a cold lurch in her stomach, because she had seen it on her own mother's face once years ago, in a context she had never spoken of out loud. It was the expression of someone who had been told in so many words that her feelings were not permitted. Elizabeth had set down her box and asked very quietly, "Miss Beaumont, are you all right?" And Clara Beaumont had said in a voice that was perfectly controlled, "I am perfectly well. Thank you, Miss Carter." And Elizabeth, because she was a seamstress and not a family friend, and not in any position to push, had picked up her pins and said nothing more. But she had watched. She had watched the way Clara held herself differently when certain names were mentioned. The way she went still, a particular kind of still, when her brother Thomas stopped by the house during a fitting. The way she seemed to be physically smaller in those moments, her shoulders coming in, her chin dropping like someone bracing for something. Thomas Beaumont was 27. He was handsome and charming, and laughed loudly, and called Elizabeth, "my dear girl," in a way that made her feel like an object in the room, rather than a person in it. He was the kind of man who used ease and charm the way other men used a fist. Elizabeth had started writing things down. Not because she planned to do anything. Just because she was a woman who kept records and something in her said, "Write this down, Lizzie," just in case. Dates, times, Things she observed. The way Clara's measurements had changed. The things Clara said, and the things she conspicuously didn't say. The one afternoon in late September, when she had heard Clara in the adjoining room speaking to someone in a voice that was barely above a whisper saying, "You can't keep doing this, Thomas. You can't." And then a man's voice, low and warm and utterly unbothered. "Now, Clara, let's not be dramatic." Elizabeth had not gone into that room. She was a seamstress. She had no standing, no power, no one who would believe her against the word of a Beaumont. But she had gone home that evening and written it down. Date, time, exact words as best as she could recall them. And now she stood on the corner of Market and 2nd in the November cold, with Nathaniel Whitmore's question sitting in her chest like a stone. "Is there something you know, Miss Carter?" Yes, she thought. I know something. The question was what it was worth, and what it would cost. She went to see Mrs. Hollis the next morning. Not Nathaniel, not Graves. Mrs. Hollis, the housekeeper who had been with the Whitmore household for 20 years and who had poured Elizabeth's tea without fuss, and looked at her with the straightforward assessment of a woman who worked for a living and therefore recognized one. "I need to ask you something," Elizabeth said at the kitchen door. "About Mr. Whitmore." Mrs. Hollis looked at her for a moment, then stood back and let her in. "He's eating again," Mrs. Hollis said immediately, setting a kettle to boil. "If that's what you're worried about. He wasn't the first week. Now he is." "That's something," Elizabeth said. "It's something." Mrs. Hollis turned. "What did you want to ask, dear?" "Is he a good man?" Elizabeth asked directly. Mrs. Hollis was quiet for a moment, not evasive thinking. "Hi is," she said at last. "He's private. Sometimes too private. He doesn't always ask the right questions." She paused. "But when he knows something's wrong, he does something about it. That's rarer than it sounds." Elizabeth nodded. "And Thomas Beaumont," she said. "Do you know him?" Mrs. Hollis's face changed slightly. Not dramatically, just changed. "I've met him," she said carefully. "Several times when the Beaumonts came for dinners." "What do you think of him?" Mrs. Hollis poured the boiling water with deliberate steadiness. "I think," she said, "that a man can be very charming in a drawing room, and something else entirely in a room where there are no witnesses." She set the kettle down. "That's what I think of Thomas Beaumont." Elizabeth sat with that for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She went home. She took out her ledger. She read through everything she had written, and then she made a decision. The decision did not feel brave. It felt like something between necessary and terrifying, which was perhaps what all actual bravery felt like when you were standing at the edge of it, rather than reading about it afterward. She went back to Whitmore House the following afternoon, and she asked to see Nathaniel Whitmore, and when she was brought into the same sitting room, and he came in and looked at her with that careful, bruised attentiveness, she sat down, and she placed her small ledger on the table between them, and she said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I'm telling you because I believe it's right. Not because I expect anything from you. Not because I want anything. Is that clear?" He sat down slowly. "Yes," he said. "That's clear." "I kept notes," Elizabeth said. "During the fittings for Miss Beaumont's gown. I have dates and times and details, and some of it is just measurements, but some of it—" She stopped. "Some of it is not." His eyes were on the ledger. "Before I tell you," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something. If what I tell you confirms certain things, do you intend to protect yourself, or do you intend to help her?" The question sat in the air between them. Nathaniel Whitmore looked at Elizabeth Carter for a long moment. "Both," he said. "If that's possible." Elizabeth considered that. "All right," she said. She opened the ledger, and she began to speak. The afternoon light moved across the room while she talked. Neither of them noticed it. By the time she finished, the room had gone from gold to gray, and Mrs. Hollis had quietly left a lamp burning in the hallway outside the door without being asked, because she had seen what happened to light when two people were talking in earnest and forgot to track the hours. Nathaniel did not interrupt her. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on her face, and he listened. The way people listen when they are processing something that changes the shape of the landscape they thought they were standing in. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "Thomas Beaumont," he said finally. His voice was very controlled. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "And she—" He stopped. Clara was afraid. All along she was— "I believe so," Elizabeth said. "I can't tell you what was said between them in private. I can only tell you what I observed and what I heard and what I wrote down." He stood up, walked to the window, stood there for a moment with his back to her, and Elizabeth sat quietly and let him have it. When he turned back around, his face had settled into something harder and more purposeful than she had seen from him before. The grief was still there, but underneath it now was something else. "She didn't leave because of me," he said. "No," Elizabeth said gently. "I don't believe she did." Something moved through his expression. It was not relief exactly. It was more complicated than relief, and she respected him for not simplifying it. "She ran," he said slowly, "because it was the only move she had." "I believe so, yes." He sat back down. His eyes went to the ledger. "Will you let me have that?" he asked carefully. Elizabeth put her hand on it. "No," she said. "I will not give this to you. It is my record. I kept it. If anything is to be done with it, I'll decide how and when." She paused. "But I will tell you what's in it. And I will tell it to anyone else who needs to hear it, if it comes to that." Nathaniel Whitmore looked at her with an expression that was startled and thoughtful, and something that might, if she were reading it right, have been the beginning of respect. "All right, Miss Carter," he said quietly. "We'll do it your way." Elizabeth nodded once, closed the ledger, put it back in her bag. Outside, the November wind was picking up. She could hear it against the window glass, cold and honest and indifferent to the business of human beings trying to set things right. She had no idea what would happen next. She had no idea whether it would matter, or whether a seamstress's small, careful notes would stand up against the weight of a name like Beaumont. But she had spoken. And Nathaniel Whitmore had listened. And for now, in this quiet room in the growing dark, that was enough. The morning after Elizabeth told Nathaniel everything, she woke up before dawn and lay still in the dark, listening to the wind against her window, and wondering if she had made the worst mistake of her life. It wasn't regret exactly. It was the particular cold feeling that comes after you've done something you can't undo, when the courage that carried you through it has burned itself out and left you alone with the consequences. She had spoken. She had opened her ledger to a man she had known for less than a week. She had handed him something that could, depending on how he chose to use it, either protect Clara Beaumont or destroy what little stability Elizabeth herself had built. She got up. She built her fire. She sat down at her sewing table in the gray early morning and told herself to work. She had 3 commissions waiting. Mrs. Abernathy's winter coat needed its buttons resewn. The Prewitt girls wanted matching holiday dresses. And now there were Nathaniel Whitmore's aunt's gowns, fabric to be selected, measurements to be taken, patterns to be cut. She had enough work to fill every hour of every day for the next month, and no business sitting by her fire cataloging her fears like they were inventory. She picked up Mrs. Abernathy's coat and began on the buttons. She had sewn the 4th one back on when someone knocked at her door. It was barely 7 in the morning. Elizabeth set down her work, crossed to the door, and opened it. A young woman stood on her step. She was perhaps 17, dressed in household servant's clothing. Plain brown dress, white apron, no cloak despite the cold. She was shivering, and her eyes were moving in the way eyes move when a person is watching for something over their shoulder. "Are you Miss Carter?" she said. "The seamstress." "I am," Elizabeth said. "My name is Jenny. I'm a housemaid at the Beaumont house." She said it in a rush, the way people say things they've spent time deciding to say. "I was told that you knew about Miss Clara, that you were—" "Come inside," Elizabeth said. She brought Jenny in, set her by the fire, put a cup of tea in her hands. The girl wrapped both palms around the cup and stared at the flames. "Start from the beginning," Elizabeth said quietly. Jenny was quiet for a moment. Then, "Miss Clara is gone. I mean, everybody knows that. But nobody knows where she went. Her family says she ran off in a fit, that she was unstable, that she'd been unwell, that Mr. Whitmore was better off without her." She stopped, took a breath. "But that's not what happened." "I know," Elizabeth said. "What do you know?" Jenny looked up at her with eyes that were frightened and determined in equal measure. "I helped her leave," she said. The fire crackled between them. Elizabeth set down her own cup. "Tell me," so Jenny told her. The night before the wedding, she had heard Clara pacing in her room back and forth, the measured, urgent pacing of someone who has made a decision but hasn't acted on it yet. Jenny had knocked. Clara had opened the door with a face that told her everything, and one bag already packed on the floor behind her. She said, "I can't stay here, Jenny. I cannot stay in this house one more night." And I said, "Miss Clara, where will you go?" And she said, "Anywhere that is not here." Jenny had helped her. She had given Clara her own savings, all $6 of it folded into Clara's palm. She had helped her out the back door in the dark, given her directions to the coaching road east, and watched her disappear into the night. "I didn't tell anyone," Jenny said. "They questioned me the next day after the wedding after she didn't come. Mr. Thomas was in a rage. He grabbed my arm when he questioned me." She pushed her sleeve up briefly. The bruise there was yellow-green, nearly a week old. "He told me if I said anything, I would be turned out without a reference, and my family would know I was a thief." Elizabeth looked at the bruise. Something settled in her chest. The cold, clear kind of settled. "Jenny," she said, "did Clara ever tell you directly what she was running from?" Jenny put her sleeve back down. Her jaw worked briefly. "She said it was Thomas." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "She said he'd been controlling her for a long time. Since before the engagement was arranged. She said the engagement itself was his idea, not hers, not Mr. Whitmore's. Thomas arranged it because it brought the family money and influence, and it moved Clara far enough away that she... Jenny stopped. "That she would be out of his reach," Elizabeth said quietly. Jenny nodded. "But then she realized," Jenny continued, "that being out of his reach wasn't going to save her, that he'd just follow, use the family connection, use Mr. Whitmore's own house and hospitality to keep her where he wanted her." She looked at Elizabeth with something very direct. Miss Clara said, "The only way out is to disappear entirely," so she did. Elizabeth sat with this for a long moment. Everything she had written in her ledger, the observations, the overheard fragments, the careful dated entries, all of it clicked into alignment with what Jenny was describing, and the complete picture that formed was one that made her very, very still. "Jenny," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." She waited until Jenny met her eyes. "Would you be willing to tell someone else what you've just told me officially? In front of witnesses, if it came to that?" Jenny's hands tightened around the cup. "I'd lose my position," she said. "Probably," Elizabeth agreed. She did not lie to her. "But you helped her, which means you already chose a side. And right now, Thomas Beaumont is telling anyone who'll listen that Clara ran off because she was unstable. If no one contradicts that, it becomes the truth people believe." Jenny was quiet for a long time. Outside, the morning was getting lighter. A cart went past on the road. A dog barked twice and went quiet. "My mother needs my wage," Jenny said softly. "I know," Elizabeth said. "I understand exactly what that means." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just going to tell you that I'm already in this, and you're not alone in it." Jenny looked at her. Then she said, "All right." Elizabeth nodded once. "Thank you," she said. "Now drink your tea before it goes cold." She had Jenny stay until she'd warmed through, then sent her home by the back street cautious, because caution was warranted, and immediately put on her cloak and went to Whitmore House. She was shown into the library this time, not the sitting room. The library was the room of a man who actually read shelves to the ceiling, papers on the desk in organized stacks, a fire already built high. Nathaniel was standing when she came in, and he turned quickly when he heard her, and she could see from the way he stood that he had been waiting. Not necessarily for her, but waiting the way people wait when they know something is unresolved and they can't rest until it is. "Miss Carter," he said. Something's happened, Elizabeth said. She didn't sit down. She told him about Jenny quickly and plainly, what the girl had said and what she had agreed to. Nathaniel listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for exactly 5 seconds. Thomas Beaumont arranged the engagement himself, he said. Yes. For money and influence. And to control where Clara was located. He turned away from her and put both hands on the edge of his desk and stood there with his head down for a moment that Elizabeth did not interrupt. Then he said very quietly, "I was used." She didn't say anything. The whole courtship, 3 years, I was simply a piece of a plan Thomas Beaumont made for his own benefit. That's how it appears, Elizabeth said carefully. Yes. And Clara? He stopped. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, stripped down. Clara endured it. She tried to find a way through. And when she couldn't, she ran, because that was the only power she had. Yes, Elizabeth said. He straightened up. When he turned back around, his face was the face of a man who had resolved something. I'm going to find her, he said. Elizabeth went still. Mr. Whitmore, not to bring her back, he said quickly. Not to make any demands. I want to find her to make certain she's safe. And to tell her... He stopped. To tell her that I understand. And that whatever she needs to rebuild, I'll help provide it. Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. She was reading him the way she had always read people, through small, careful observation, not because she distrusted him, but because she was not in the habit of assuming. He looked back at her steadily. All right, she said. But if you go looking for her, Thomas Beaumont will know, and he'll move first. You'll need to be careful about who you trust. I trust you, Nathaniel said. She hadn't expected him to say it that directly. It landed in the room with a weight she hadn't prepared for. You've known me for a week, she said. I know, he said. But I know what I saw, and what I've seen since. He held her gaze. You came here with nothing to gain. You told me the truth when you could have stayed out of it. You're still here, still pushing when any sensible person would have stepped back. A pause. I trust that. I trust what a person does when they have nothing to gain. Elizabeth stood very straight. Then you should know, she said carefully, that I am also going to talk to Clara myself. If we find her, before you do, because she doesn't know you the way... She stopped, rephrased. She's going to be frightened. She needs to hear from someone who has no authority over her before she'll speak freely. Agreed, Nathaniel said without hesitation. She almost said, you are not what I expected from a man in your position. She caught it in time and said instead, good. Then we need to start by finding out where she went. Jenny said the coaching road east. There are 4 eastern coaching stops she could have reached on foot by morning, Nathaniel said. He was already moving toward the desk, already reaching for paper. I know the innkeepers at 2 of them. I know the seamstress at a 3rd, Elizabeth said. Mrs. Fowler in Versailles. If a woman came through alone with nothing but a bag, Mrs. Fowler would have noticed. Nathaniel looked up from his desk. A seamstress, he said. We notice people, Elizabeth said simply. It's the job. He held her gaze for a moment, and something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but the particular expression of a man revising an assumption. Right, he said. Then let's begin. They did not find Clara that day, nor the next. Elizabeth sent a letter to Mrs. Fowler through a carrier she trusted carefully, worded asking only whether any young women had passed through requiring assistance, giving no names. She had a reply in 3 days. Yes, a young woman well-dressed but traveling light had stopped for 2 nights before continuing east toward Frankfurt. Nathaniel's contacts at the coaching stops yielded nothing directly, but confirmed a woman matching Clara's description had purchased a seat on an eastbound coach the morning after the wedding. Frankfurt then, possibly farther. In the meantime, the town was talking. This was the thing Elizabeth had known would happen and had prepared herself for, and had still somehow underestimated. The story circulating through Lexington's parlors and church halls was the one Thomas Beaumont's people had carefully released. Clara had suffered a breakdown. She had been unwell for some time. The wedding had been a pressure too great for her fragile constitution. Her family was heartbroken. Mr. Whitmore had their deepest sympathies. The whole tragic business was really nobody's fault. It was, Elizabeth thought, a masterpiece of calculated misdirection. It made Clara the problem. It made Thomas a grieving brother. It closed off every avenue of inquiry by placing the blame on the one person who wasn't there to dispute it. She was thinking about this standing in her workroom, nominally cutting fabric for the aunt's second gown, actually thinking very hard, when the door opened without a knock, and Thomas Beaumont walked in. She knew him immediately from the fittings. He had the same charm and the same ease and the same way of entering a room as if it had been waiting for him. He was wearing a coat she recognized, expensive, fashionable Virginia cut. I was smiling. Elizabeth did not put down her shears. "Miss Carter," he said pleasantly. "What a charming little shop." "It's a workroom," Elizabeth said. "I don't take walk-in visitors." He waved this off like it was a minor, adorable misunderstanding. "I won't take a moment of your time. I just wanted to have a friendly word." He stepped further into the room anyway, moving with the unhurried ease of a man who had never encountered a door that stayed closed to him. "I understand you've been speaking to Nathaniel Whitmore." Elizabeth held his gaze. She did not step back. "I have several clients," she said. "I don't discuss my business relationships." "Of course not," Thomas agreed warmly. "Professional discretion. I respect that. I wanted to reassure you, actually. Nathaniel is a good man, a fine man, and I think his grief has led him into some, shall we say, unhelpful lines of inquiry." He tilted his head slightly. "My sister's situation is a family matter. A private medical matter, really. I'd hate to see anyone get drawn into something they don't understand." "Is that a warning?" Elizabeth asked. Thomas laughed. It was a good laugh. Easy musical, the kind that belonged in drawing rooms. "It's friendly concern," he said. "You're a working woman, Miss Carter. You rely on references, on reputation, on the goodwill of Lexington's families. I'm sure you wouldn't want anything to interfere with that." He let that sit. Then he smiled again, the same warm smile, and said, "Give my best to Mr. Whitmore," and walked back out the door. Elizabeth stood very still in the silence he left behind. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. Good. She needed them to be. She locked her workroom door, went to her desk, opened her ledger, and wrote down the date, the time, and every word Thomas Beaumont had just said to her. She wrote tone was pleasant, implied threat referenced. Whitmore directly mentioned my reputation explicitly. Then she put on her cloak and went to Whitmore House. Nathaniel was in the middle of a meeting with his estate manager when she arrived, and Graves appeared in the hallway with his customary expression of mild professional resistance. "Mr. Whitmore is engaged," Graves said. "Thomas Beaumont just came to my workroom," Elizabeth said. Graves opened the library door immediately. Nathaniel was on his feet before she finished speaking. She told him what had happened. The whole exchange, word for word, the same way she had recorded it. No embellishment, no softening, just the facts in sequence. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "He went to your workroom," Nathaniel said. "Yes, he went to your workroom." His voice had the particular flatness of a man controlling something that wants to come out much louder. "To threaten a woman who has nothing to do with his family professionally, who is a private citizen with no official standing in any of this. He walked into your place of business and implied consequences." "It was very friendly," Elizabeth said dryly. He smiled throughout. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Are you frightened?" She considered the question seriously. "I'm alert," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her with that expression again, the one she was starting to recognize, the one she didn't quite have a word for yet, that lived somewhere between admiration and something more complicated. "Miss Carter," he said, "I owe you an apology." She blinked. That was not what she'd expected him to say. "When I brought you into this, when I started asking you questions, asking for your help, I didn't fully consider what it would cost you." He shook his head slowly. "You're not in a position to have a powerful family threatening your livelihood. You have no protection. And I asked you to walk into the middle of this because—" He stopped. "Because it was convenient for me. And I'm sorry." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Whitmore," she said finally, I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear it carefully. She waited until he was looking at her directly. I made a choice. I opened my ledger. I spoke to you. I spoke to Jenny. I walked into this because I decided to, and not because you asked me. I'm a grown woman with a full understanding of the risks, and I don't need you to manage my choices for me. I need you to take what I know and use it correctly. He held her gaze. Furthermore, she continued, the fact that Thomas Beaumont came to warn me means he's frightened. A man who is secure doesn't bother warning people. He only warns people when he thinks they're a genuine threat. She paused. Which means we're getting somewhere. Nathaniel stared at her. Then quietly, almost to himself, you are extraordinary, Miss Carter. Elizabeth felt the color move in her face and was irritated by it. Don't be dramatic, she said. I'm practical. There's a difference. There isn't, he said. In my experience, the two are the same thing. She didn't answer that. She moved on instead because moving on was safer. We need to find Clara before Thomas does. If she's in Frankfurt, she may have found some kind of situation, a household willing to employ her, a relative. Whatever it is, we need to reach her first. Nathaniel nodded. The moment had passed or been set aside. They were back on the work, which was where Elizabeth was most comfortable. I'll go to Frankfurt, he said. I'll write to Mrs. Fowler again. She has connections east of here. I'll need someone Thomas doesn't recognize. He paused. Someone who can travel without drawing attention. I can travel, Elizabeth said. He looked at her. A seamstress making delivery calls, she said calmly. It's entirely ordinary. Nobody looks twice. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him weighing things, the risk to her, the practicality, whatever else was moving behind his face. We'd travel separately, he said. Arrive separately. Meet at the Fowler shop in Versailles, Elizabeth said. Mrs. Fowler owes me a favor, and she'll let us use her back room. I was looking at her with something she was increasingly recognizing as a kind of helpless respect, the expression of a man who has organized his life according to certain assumptions about how things work and how people behave, and is encountering consistent evidence that the assumptions were incomplete. All right, he said, and then slightly quieter, Miss Carter. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. Again. She picked up her cloak. Stop thanking me, she said. And get moving. Thomas isn't standing still. She was at the door when he said, Lizzie. She stopped. She turned. She'd said her given name once in passing on the church path. She'd forgotten he might have kept it. He looked slightly uncertain, a thing she didn't see on him often. Is that may I? She considered him for a moment. This wealthy, bruised, serious man who listened carefully and did not waste her time and had just apologized in a way that cost him something. You may, she said, and she walked out before either of them could say anything else. Outside the cold was sharp and clean and honest, and Elizabeth Carter pulled her cloak close and walked fast, and tried not to think too hard about the precise feeling that had moved through her chest in the moment before she'd left the room. She had work to do. She had a ledger full of evidence, and a girl's bruised arm, and a woman somewhere east of Lexington who needed finding. She had Thomas Beaumont's implied threat sitting in her records, and a journey to plan and letters to write. She had absolutely no business noticing anything about the way Nathaniel Whitmore said her name. She walked faster. Behind her, Whitmore House stood solid and quiet against the November sky, and inside it for the first time in 2 weeks, something was beginning to move. They left for Versailles on a Thursday. Elizabeth went first, 2 hours ahead, in a hired coach with her workbox on the seat beside her and a bundle of fabric samples across her lap. The kind of things a seamstress carried when she was making delivery calls. She wore her plain gray travel dress and her most unremarkable bonnet, and she sat with her back straight and her hands folded and looked like exactly what she was supposed to look like, a working woman going about her business. She did not look like a woman carrying a ledger full of evidence against one of the most powerful families in Kentucky. But she was. Nathaniel followed by a different road. They had agreed on that. 2 separate arrivals, nothing to connect them, nothing to give Thomas Beaumont's people, and she had no doubt he had people watching anything to report. Mrs. Fowler's shop in Versailles was on a quiet side street, the kind of place that had been there long enough to become invisible to the people who passed it every day. Agnes Fowler was 62 years old, built like a woman who had been working with her hands her entire life, and she had the particular manner of someone who had seen enough of human nature to be unsurprised by most of it. She met Elizabeth at the back door. "Got your letter," she said. "Come in." No preamble. No questions. Just a pot of coffee on the stove and 2 chairs pulled up near it. Elizabeth sat down and let the warmth of the room reach her bones. She'd been colder than she realized. "You said you were looking for a young woman," Agnes said. "Well-dressed, traveling alone." "Yes." Agnes poured the coffee, set a cup in front of her. "She was here," she said. "Stayed 2 nights like I told you. Paid in coin, not much but enough. Didn't give a name." She paused. "But she talked." Elizabeth looked up. "What did she say?" "Not much to begin with. Second day she helped me press some seams, offered to said she wanted something to do with her hands. That's when she talked." Agnes wrapped her own hands around her cup. "She said she was going to a cousin in Frankfurt. Said the cousin didn't know she was coming but would take her in. Said she'd figure the rest out when she got there." She looked at Elizabeth steadily. She was frightened. Not the ordinary kind of frightened, the kind that's been living in a body for a long time. Elizabeth nodded. She knew that kind. "Did she say anything about her family?" Agnes was quiet for a moment. "She said her brother would come looking." She set her cup down. "She said if a man comes asking, charming man, good coat, Virginia accent, don't tell him anything. She said please." Agnes looked at Elizabeth with clear eyes. "I told her I hadn't seen anyone, and that's what I'll keep telling people." A brief pause. "Except you." "Thank you, Agnes." "Don't thank me yet." Agnes rose, went to a small desk in the corner, opened a drawer. She came back with a folded piece of paper and set it on the table between them. She left this, addressed it to nobody, said if someone came looking, someone safe, they'd know what to do with it. Elizabeth unfolded it. It was brief. The handwriting was controlled but uneven at the edges, like someone who had been writing with shaking hands and was trying very hard not to show it. It said, "I am not unstable. I am not unwell. I am not what my brother will tell you I am. I am a woman who was afraid, and I ran because running was all I had. If anyone ever finds this who knew Nathaniel Whitmore, please tell him I am sorry. Please tell him it was never about him." Elizabeth folded it carefully, put it in her pocket, next to her ledger. She was still sitting with that when she heard the knock at the back door, and Agnes went to answer it, and Nathaniel Whitmore stepped into the back room of a small seamstress's shop in Versailles, Kentucky. Ducking slightly to clear the doorframe, his face set and focused, and his eyes going immediately to Elizabeth. "You found something," he said, not a question. "Sit down," she said, "and let Agnes pour you a coffee." He read the note standing up. He read it twice. Then he sat down. For a moment he didn't speak. He held the paper with both hands and looked at it like a man trying to memorize something he was afraid of losing. "Never about him," he said finally very quietly. "No," Elizabeth said. "It wasn't." He set the paper on the table. "I need to find her cousin in Frankfurt." "We need to find her cousin," Elizabeth said. He looked at her. She held his gaze evenly. "I told you, she needs to hear from someone without authority over her before she'll speak freely. That is still true." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right." Agnes, who had been sitting at the far end of the table, with the particular stillness of a woman who knew when not to interfere, said, "The cousin's name is Margaret Alcott. Her husband is a printer on Commerce Street in Frankfurt. I got that from the girl before she left." She looked between them. "Figured it might be useful." Elizabeth looked at Agnes Fowler with considerable admiration. "Agnes," she said, "you are a remarkable woman." Agnes waved a hand. "I'm a seamstress," she said. "We notice things." Nathaniel looked from one to the other of them. Something crossed his face that might have been the beginnings of a smile, but he was still too careful for it to fully arrive. They stayed another hour planning. Then Nathaniel went ahead to Frankfurt. He'd cover the distance faster by horseback, and Elizabeth followed the next morning by coach. She spent the night in Agnes's spare room and lay awake in the dark, thinking about Clara Beaumont alone, somewhere in Frankfurt, sleeping in a cousin's house, waiting to find out if the world was going to catch up with her. She thought about Thomas Beaumont walking into her workroom with his warm smile and his friendly threat. She thought about Jenny's bruised arm. She thought about the way Nathaniel had said her name Lizzie, and the way it had moved through her like a stone dropped into still water. She told herself firmly to go to sleep. She did not go to sleep for quite some time. Margaret Alcott's house was small and neat, and situated above her husband's print shop in a way that made the whole building smell faintly of ink and paper. The sign over the door said Alcott & Sons Printers, even though the sons in question were 7 and 4 years old and not yet contributing professionally. Elizabeth arrived mid-morning, tension of someone managing more than she'd expected. She looked at Elizabeth with immediate wariness. "Mrs. Alcott," Elizabeth said. "My name is Elizabeth Carter. I'm a seamstress from Lexington. I'm looking for your cousin." Margaret Alcott's face went very still. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "I know Clara is here," Elizabeth said quietly. "I'm not with her family. I'm not with anyone who wishes her harm. I made her wedding gown, and I've been keeping records of things I observed during that work, and I need to speak with her." She paused. "Please." The door stayed half-closed for a long moment. Then from somewhere inside the house a voice said, "Maggie, let her in." Clara Beaumont was sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of tea. She wasn't drinking, and the particular composure of a woman who has been holding herself together through sheer force of will for so long, it's become indistinguishable from her normal posture. She was thinner than Elizabeth remembered. Her dress was borrowed, Elizabeth could tell by the slightly wrong fit across the shoulders, but her eyes were clear. "Miss Carter," she said. "Miss Beaumont." Elizabeth sat down across from her. "You look better than I expected." Clara let out a short breath, almost a laugh. "You always were direct." "I'm afraid so." Elizabeth put her hands flat on the table. "I need to tell you some things, and then I need to ask you some things. And you don't have to answer any of it if you don't want to." Clara looked at her steadily. "Is Nathaniel with you?" "He's in Frankfurt," Elizabeth said. "He knows where you are. He's not coming to this house unless you ask him to." Clara was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face, complicated, layered, not simple to read. "How did he take it?" she asked. "The wedding." "Hard," Elizabeth said honestly. "But he's—" She stopped, chose her words. "He's not angry at you. He understands more than you think." Clara's jaw worked briefly. "Thomas will have told him I was unstable." "Thomas told everyone you were unstable. Nathaniel does not believe it." Clara looked at her. Something flickered. "Why not?" "Because I told him otherwise." The room was very quiet for a moment. Margaret had moved to the far end of the kitchen, doing something at the stove that kept her back tactfully turned. Clara said slowly, "You told him." "I told him what I observed. I've been keeping records since October. Dates times things I noticed during the fittings." Elizabeth held her gaze. "I know about Thomas, not everything, but enough." The composure held, barely. Clara's hands around the teacup tightened fractionally. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. Her voice was very careful. "That depends on what you want," Elizabeth said. "I'm not going to do anything without your agreement. This is your life, your story. I just happened to have been in the room for some of it, and I wrote things down." She paused. "But I need you to know Thomas came to my workroom 3 days ago. He warned me. Friendly and pleasant the way he does. He implied I could lose my reputation and my livelihood if I kept talking." Something went through Clara's face then. Not surprise. Resignation. "That sounds like him," she said. "It does," Elizabeth agreed. "Which is why I'm still talking." Clara looked down at her cup. "I was 13, she said abruptly. "When it started, he was 19. She didn't look up. "He told me it was normal, that it was what families did, that I was being dramatic if I was upset." A long pause. "By the time I understood it wasn't normal, I was already inside something I didn't know how to get out of." Elizabeth didn't say anything. She had learned a long time ago that some things needed to be said into silence. The engagement was his idea, Clara continued. He told Father that Nathaniel Whitmore was an excellent match. He handled all the arrangements. He told me— Her voice dropped. He told me if I behaved and married well, he'd leave me alone. That distance was what he wanted. She finally looked up. So I believed him. I told myself it was over. I made myself be glad about the wedding. But then you realized, Elizabeth said quietly. I realized that distance wouldn't matter to him. That he'd visit. Use Nathaniel's home as a place to be welcomed. Use the family connection. She shook her head. I realized that marrying Nathaniel would just give Thomas a larger house to walk through. She put the cup down. I couldn't do it. I couldn't walk into that church knowing what it meant. So I ran. She looked at Elizabeth with eyes that were very direct and very tired. I didn't think about what it would do to Nathaniel. I just ran. Clara, Elizabeth said. Running was the right thing to do. The only thing that matters now is what comes next. What does come next? Clara asked. Elizabeth took a breath. I think, she said slowly, that Thomas Beaumont has been doing what he does because nobody has ever made him answer for it. He's moved through the world in rooms without witnesses, and when there were witnesses, he made sure they had reasons to stay quiet. She looked at Clara directly. But I have a ledger. Jenny has a bruised arm and a story. You have the truth. And Nathaniel Whitmore has more standing in Fayette County than Thomas Beaumont will ever have. Clara stared at her. You're talking about doing something with it, she said. I'm talking about giving you options, Elizabeth said. I'm not going to push you toward anything, but I need you to know that you're not as alone in this as you were when you left Lexington. Clara was quiet for a long time. Margaret still had her back turned at the stove. The print shop below made a faint rhythmic sound. Then Clara said, Can I see him, Nathaniel? Yes, Elizabeth said. If you want to. I want to explain, Clara said. He deserves an explanation. He does, Elizabeth agreed. Will you stay? Clara asked. And for the first time her composure slipped slightly, not much but enough. When I talk to him, will you be there? Elizabeth looked at her. This woman who had run because running was all she had, who was sitting in a borrowed dress in her cousin's kitchen, asking a seamstress to stand beside her. Yes, Elizabeth said. I'll be there. She sent word to Nathaniel through Margaret's husband, and he came that afternoon, and Elizabeth opened the door herself and brought him into the kitchen and positioned herself at the table, like something between a witness and a wall. And then she sat quietly while Clara Beaumont told Nathaniel Whitmore the truth. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not perform his reactions. Elizabeth watched him carefully enough to be sure of that. He was a man receiving something real, and he treated it like something real. When Clara finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Nathaniel said, I'm sorry I didn't ask better questions. Clara blinked. I'm sorry, he said again simply. You were trying to find a way through an impossible situation, and I was conducting a courtship. I was playing a role. I wasn't— He stopped. I should have asked you once in those 3 years what you were afraid of. I never did. Clara's composure finally actually broke. Not dramatically. She just pressed one hand over her mouth for a moment and breathed. You couldn't have known, she said. I know, he said. But I should have asked. Elizabeth looked at her hands and gave them a moment. Then Nathaniel straightened. Now, he said, his voice shifting into something firmer. Thomas. Clara's hand dropped. She steadied. I've been speaking with a man named Judge Harlan Whitley, Nathaniel said. He's a circuit court judge. He's been in Lexington since before I was born. He is not a man Thomas Beaumont has influence over. He paused. I haven't told him details yet. I was waiting. His eyes moved to Elizabeth briefly. I was waiting until I knew what we had. What do we need? Elizabeth asked. Testimony, Nathaniel said. Clara's if she'll give it. Jenny's, your records. He looked at Elizabeth steadily. And we need to do it before Thomas realizes what we're building. Once he knows there's a formal proceeding, even an informal inquiry, he'll move to discredit every source we have. He already started on me, Elizabeth said. He'll try Jenny next. Jenny needs to be somewhere Thomas can't reach her, Clara said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. She sat up straighter. She helped me. She used her savings. She risked her position. Clara's voice had taken on something new, firmer, with an edge of anger in it that had not been there before. She cannot be left where Thomas can walk through a door and threaten her. Agreed, Nathaniel said. I can arrange for her to come to Whitmore House. As employed household staff. Legitimate employment, proper wage out of the Beaumont household immediately. Clara looked at him. Something moved across her face. You thought of that already, she said. Miss Carter suggested it, he said. He glanced at Elizabeth briefly. Elizabeth said nothing because she had not suggested it. He had thought of it himself, and she found it interesting that he chose to credit her for it. She filed that observation away. Then we move quickly, Elizabeth said. Jenny first. Get her out before Thomas notices. Then Judge Whitley. There's something else, Nathaniel said. He hesitated the first time she had seen him hesitate in this way, a careful, private hesitation. My solicitor in Lexington, Aldous Marsh, has been with my family for 20 years. He found something in the paperwork from the engagement arrangements. He looked at Clara. Thomas Beaumont negotiated a significant financial settlement as part of the marriage contract. Payable to the Beaumont family specifically as it's worded to Thomas Beaumont personally upon completion of the marriage. The room went completely still. How much? Clara said. $8,000, Nathaniel said. The number sat in the room like a stone dropped into a well. Elizabeth heard the sound of it land. $8,000. Not a wedding gift. Not a family arrangement. A payment. To Thomas personally. Contingent on the marriage being completed. He wasn't just controlling her, Elizabeth said slowly. He was selling her. That's the word my solicitor used, Nathaniel said. In more legal language, but yes. Clara had gone very still. Her face was the face of someone watching a landscape rearrange itself around a truth she'd suspected but never seen in its full shape before. That money, she said. That's why he needed the wedding to happen. That's why he kept pushing, kept telling me to behave, that's... She stopped. That's why he's so frightened now. Because he lost $8,000 when you ran, Elizabeth said. And because if anyone looks at that contract closely, Nathaniel said, and then looks at the other things, the testimony, the records. Thomas Beaumont doesn't just lose the money. He loses considerably more than that. Elizabeth was already thinking. She could feel the shape of it, the way the pieces fit the contract, the ledger, Jenny's testimony, Clara's account, the threat to Elizabeth's workroom, all of it arranged into something that had real formal weight. Judge Whitley, she said. I'll send for him tomorrow, Nathaniel said. No, Elizabeth said. Everyone looked at her. Send for him today, right now. If Thomas has people watching, and I believe he does, every hour we wait is an hour he's using. Nathaniel held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood up and said to Margaret's husband, who was hovering at the kitchen door, Do you have a fast horse? He did. The letter went out within the hour. Nathaniel wrote it at the Alcott's kitchen table, with Elizabeth standing at his shoulder, reviewing every line. Not because she doubted him, but because she had learned in the past 2 weeks that 2 sets of eyes caught more than one, and Nathaniel had learned this too, and neither of them mentioned it anymore. They just did it. Clara watched them work. She was quiet for most of it, and Elizabeth let her be quiet. When Nathaniel sealed the letter and handed it to Margaret's husband, Clara said, Is it going to be enough? Nathaniel looked at her. I don't know, he said honestly, but it's what we have and we're going to use it. Clara nodded, once firmly. And something in her posture shifted, a degree of straightening, a degree of settling. The posture of a woman who has stopped running, not because she is caught, but because she has decided to turn around and face what's behind her. Elizabeth noticed it. She noted privately that it looked good on her. They stayed in Frankfurt another day. Nathaniel arranged accommodations at a respectable inn, separate, entirely proper though. Elizabeth noticed he chose the one with the most reputable landlady in town, the kind of establishment whose staff would have nothing to gossip about, because everything was so thoroughly above reproach. She appreciated that he thought of it without being asked. That evening, she was sitting in the inn's small common room, writing letters, one to Agnes Fowler, one to Mrs. Hollis at Whitmore House, with instructions about Jenny, one to her own commission clients, explaining a brief delay when Nathaniel came in and sat across from her. She kept writing for a moment, finishing a sentence. "You're not going to stop," he said. She looked up. "Writing. Working," he said. "Even now. Even in the middle of all this. I have 3 clients waiting for commissions," she said. "Mrs. Abernathy's buttons aren't going to sew themselves." He looked at her with that expression she was starting to recognize, the layered one, the one she was increasingly unequipped to fully interpret. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need to say it plainly, because I think you deserve plain speech." Elizabeth set down her pen. "All right," she said. "I have lived in Lexington for 15 years, he said. "I have moved in society. I have done business. I have courted a woman for 3 years. He paused. "In all of that time, I don't believe I have encountered a single person who operated the way you do." She waited. "You see things," he said. "You write them down. You keep them. You use them at exactly the right moment, for exactly the right reason. And you do it all without ever once making it about yourself." He stopped. "I don't know how you learned to do that." "My mother," Elizabeth said simply. "She taught me to keep records. She said a woman with no wealth and no name had to have something that was hers and couldn't be taken. She said, 'Write it down, Lizzie. They can take your money and your position and your reputation, but they can't take what you witnessed if you wrote it down.'" Nathaniel looked at her. "She was right," he said. "She was almost always right." Elizabeth picked up her pen again. She just ran out of time to be right in. The fire in the common room was warm. Outside Frankfurt was quiet. The night settled around the inn like a held breath. Somewhere down the hall, Clara Beaumont was sleeping in a room that was not her brother's house, and Jenny was being moved even now from the Beaumont household to Whitmore House, and a letter was riding toward Judge Harlan Whitley with both their names at the bottom. "What happens," Nathaniel said slowly, "after?" She looked up. "When this is when it's done, one way or another." He met her eyes. "What do you want, Lizzie, for yourself?" The question surprised her. People did not often ask her that. People asked her about her work, her commissions, her rates. Nobody asked what she wanted for herself. She thought about it honestly the way she did everything. "I want a larger workroom," she said. "I want to take on 2 apprentices. I want enough commissions that I can choose which ones I take." She paused. I want to be known for something that's mine, not for being useful to someone else's story." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You will be," he said. It was very simple. No flourish, no offer attached to it. Just a statement the way he stated things when he believed them. Elizabeth looked at him for a moment that was slightly longer than it needed to be. Then she looked back at her letter. "Go to bed," she said. "We need to be sharp tomorrow." She heard him stand. "Lizzie," he said. She looked up again. He held her gaze for a moment. He had the particular expression of a man who has something more to say and knows this is not the moment to say it. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. And she went back to her letter, and she did not lift her eyes from the page until she heard his footsteps move down the hall and the door of his room close quietly behind him. Then she sat still for a moment in the warmth of the fire. Then she finished her letter. But her handwriting for the first half of the next paragraph was slightly less even than usual. She noticed it, smoothed it out, kept writing. Outside the night held its breath. Tomorrow everything would begin in earnest. Judge Harlan Whitley arrived in Frankfurt on a Friday morning, and he was not what Elizabeth had expected. She had expected someone imposing. Someone who carried his authority visibly the way powerful men usually did, in the set of his jaw, the cut of his coat, the deliberate pace of his walk. She had expected someone who would require convincing. Judge Whitley was 71 years old and moved like a man who had stopped performing dignity sometime around his 50th year because he no longer needed to. He was small, spare, white-haired, and he walked into the Alcott's kitchen with his hat already off and his eyes already reading the room before he said a single word. He looked at Clara first, then at Elizabeth, then at Nathaniel, Then he sat down, put his hat on the table and said, "All right, tell me everything. Start at the beginning and don't leave anything out to spare my feelings." So they told him. Elizabeth went first. She opened her ledger on the table and read from it dates, times, observations, the exact words she had recorded from the hallway outside Clara's fitting room, the details of Thomas Beaumont's visit to her workroom. She read it all without commentary, without emotion, letting the entries speak for what they were. A careful, consistent, documented record kept by a woman who had no reason to fabricate any of it. Judge Whitley listened with his elbows on the table and his chin in his hand and his eyes on the ledger. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he looked up. "You kept this in real time," he said. "Not after the fact." "The dates are there," Elizabeth said. "And the ink is different weights. You can see where I wrote quickly and where I wrote slowly. It wasn't composed after the fact." He nodded, looked at Nathaniel. "The contract." Nathaniel slid a copy across the table. Aldous Marsh had sent it by courier the day before. Whitley read it slowly. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes did. 8,000, he said to no one in particular. "Payable to Thomas Beaumont personally upon completion of the marriage," Nathaniel said. Whitley set it down, looked at Clara. "Miss Beaumont," he said. His voice had changed, still direct, but something in it had gone careful, the way voices go careful when they are addressing something fragile and don't want to break it. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. Whatever you say in this room today is said to me informally. Nothing goes anywhere without your agreement. Do you understand that?" Clara looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Good." He waited. She talked for 40 minutes. Elizabeth had heard most of it already, but she listened anyway, because the second hearing of something always caught the things the first hearing had let fall through. Judge Whitley didn't take notes. He just listened in that same still, deliberate way, like a man who had learned that the most useful thing you could offer another person was your full, unperformed attention. When Clara finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Whitley was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The bruised arm, the housemaid." "Jenny," Elizabeth said. "She's at Whitmore House now." "I'll need to speak with her." He looked at Nathaniel. "Can you bring her to Lexington by Tuesday?" "Yes," Nathaniel said. Whitley nodded slowly. He picked up his hat from the table, turned it in his hands. "I want you to understand something," he said to all of them, and to none of them in particular. "What I can do formally is limited. Thomas Beaumont has not been charged with anything. There is no case before a court. What I have is a set of accounts from credible witnesses, a contract that merits scrutiny, and a pattern of behavior that is—" He stopped, chose his words with the care of a man who had spent 50 years minding the weight of them. "Profoundly disturbing. But," Nathaniel said. "But I have been on the circuit bench for 26 years, Whitley said, "and I know which conversations to have, and with whom, and in what order." He looked at Nathaniel directly. "Senator Beaumont has political standing. His son has money and a name. What they do not have is 26 years of favors owed to them by people I trust." He stood up. "Leave Thomas Beaumont to me." Elizabeth looked at him. "Judge Whitley," she said, "what does 'leave him to you' mean specifically?" He looked at her with something that was unmistakably approval. "It means," he said, "that I am going to have a private conversation with Senator Beaumont, in which I lay out very clearly what I know and what I can make public if I choose to. It means the senator will be given the opportunity to do the right thing voluntarily, remove Thomas from any position of authority over his sister's affairs, return the money from that contract to Nathaniel, and ensure that Clara has legal and financial independence." He paused. "And it means that if the senator chooses not to cooperate, I make everything public in the most inconvenient way possible for the Beaumont family name." "That's leverage," Elizabeth said. "It is," Whitley agreed pleasantly. "I prefer to call it clarity, but yes." Nathaniel had been very still during this. Now he said, "And Thomas himself." Whitley looked at him steadily. "What he has done to his sister cannot be fully addressed through the mechanisms currently available to us. You know that. I know that. Clara knows that." He said it without softening it, because softening it would have been a lie. "What we can do is ensure he never has access to her again. Legally, financially, socially. We can make the cost of his continuing behavior so high that continuation becomes genuinely difficult. He paused. It is not everything, but it is not nothing. Nathaniel's jaw worked for a moment. Elizabeth watched him sit with the inadequacy of it, the particular anguish of a man who wanted a cleaner resolution than the world was prepared to offer. Then he said, "All right." Whitley nodded, picked up his hat, looked at Clara one more time. "Young woman," he said, "you were not unstable, you were not unwell. You were in an impossible situation, and you made a survival decision, and that is a mark of considerable courage." He put his hat on. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Clara looked at him. She said nothing, but her chin came up slightly. He left. The kitchen exhaled. They were back in Lexington by Sunday. The next 4 days were the longest of Elizabeth Carter's life. She went back to her workroom. She sewed Mrs. Abernathy's coat. She cut the fabric for the first of Nathaniel's aunt's gowns. She answered the Prewitt Commission. She did all of this with her hands and the part of her mind that managed thread and needle and hem allowances, while the other part of her mind ran through everything that could go wrong in the specific detailed way that practical people rehearse disasters. Thomas could move first. He could find out about Whitley before Whitley reached the senator. He could discredit Jenny before she gave her account. He could find a way to cast Elizabeth herself as a scheming interloper with a grudge, a poor seamstress who had fixated on a wealthy family for reasons that polite society would fill in with its own assumptions. She wrote all of it down, every scenario, every countermove available to them. She gave it to Nathaniel on Monday morning when he appeared at her workroom door before she had unlocked it, and he stood in the cold and read through it while she made coffee. When he came back inside, his face was the face of a man who has just been handed something that reorganized his thinking. "You already thought of most of this," Elizabeth said. "Not all of it," he said. He held up the third page. "This Thomas approaching your existing clients before the hearing. That hadn't occurred to me." "It occurred to me at 2 in the morning," Elizabeth said. "Which is when most of my best thinking happens, unfortunately." Nathaniel almost smiled. "Almost. What's the counter-move?" "I contact my clients myself first," she said. "Today. I tell them there may be a gentleman who approaches them with concerns about my character. I tell them it is related to a legal matter I am involved in as a witness. I don't give details. I simply ensure that when Thomas's voice arrives, mine has already been there." "Simple," he said. "The best things usually are." He looked at her across the workroom in the morning light. "Are you sleeping?" he asked. She paused. "Adequately. That's not the same as yes." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He sat down on the chair she kept near the door for clients. This was the second time he had simply sat down in her space, without the slight stiffness of a man from his position, sitting in a working woman's shop. She noticed she had stopped noticing it, which told her something about how quickly the past 3 weeks had moved. "I want to tell you something," he said. "You seem to say that a lot," she said. "I have a lot to tell you," he said simply. "You're the person I keep wanting to tell things to." Elizabeth looked at him. She set down her coffee. "Nathaniel," she said. She had started using his given name 2 days ago somewhere on the road back from Frankfurt, without either of them marking the moment it happened. "I know," he said before she could continue. "I know what you're going to say. That the timing is wrong. That there are 12 other things that need to happen first. That you are a working woman who built everything she has by herself, and you are not going to compromise that by allowing your judgment to be clouded by." "That is a remarkable amount of my speech to be delivering on my behalf," Elizabeth said. He stopped. "I was going to say," she continued carefully, "that I am aware of what's happening between us, and that I am choosing not to address it until the other 12 things are resolved. That's all." He held her gaze. "Choosing not to address it," he said, "not dismissing it." "Those are different things," she said. "Yes." Something moved through his face that she was not going to look at too closely right now. "All right," he said. He stood up. "Then let's resolve the 12 things." She nodded, picked up her coffee. "Starting with my client letters." He held the door for her as she went to her desk, and she allowed it, and neither of them said anything else. And it was remarkably comfortable for a moment that had contained as much as that one had. The hearing with Judge Whitley and Senator Beaumont happened on Wednesday. Elizabeth was not in the room. She had known she would not be in the room. Whitley had been clear the first conversation with the senator was private. One judge to one father. The kind of conversation that could only happen without an audience. If the senator cooperated, there would be no need for a public proceeding. If he did not, the public proceeding would happen with everyone present. Elizabeth waited at Whitmore House with Clara and Mrs. Hollis and Jenny, who had arrived on Tuesday looking exhausted and frightened, and had spent 20 minutes in Mrs. Hollis's kitchen eating soup before she stopped shaking. She had given her account to Whitley that morning. Elizabeth had sat beside her while she did it, and Jenny had been steady. Not without fear, but steady. The way people are steady when they know they are telling the truth, and have decided that matters more than their comfort. Nathaniel was in the room with Whitley and the senator, not as a party to the legal discussion, but as a witness, and a presence the weight of the Whitmore name in a county where that name meant something. Elizabeth sued. She had brought work with her the second of the aunt's gowns cut and pinned and ready for stitching, and she sat in Mrs. Hollis's sitting room and sewed while Clara sat across from her reading, and Jenny dozed in the chair by the fire, because Jenny had not slept properly in over a week, and this was the first place she had been that felt safe enough to let her guard down. Clara looked up from her book at one point and said, "You're not worried." "I am absolutely worried," Elizabeth said. "You don't look it." "The gown needs to be done by Friday," Elizabeth said. "Being worried doesn't sew it, so I'm doing both at once." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Keep going. Keep doing ordinary things when everything is, when it all feels. Because the ordinary things are what you have when everything else is uncertain," Elizabeth said. She kept her needle moving. "My mother taught me that too. She said when the world is falling apart, find one thing you can finish. Finish it, then find another." She looked up briefly. "It sounds small. It isn't." Clara held her gaze for a moment. "I want to do something," Clara said. "After. When this is whatever it is. I want to do something that's mine. Something I built." "What were you good at?" Elizabeth asked. "Before all of this. Before Thomas made everything about him." Clara thought for a moment. "Languages," she said. "French. A little Latin. I tutored the Fairfax children one summer." She paused. "I was good at it." "Then do that," Elizabeth said simply. "I have no money." "You'll have the 8,000 Nathaniel gets back from the contract," Elizabeth said. "Whatever form that takes." Clara stared at her. "I can't take his money. It was payment for selling you," Elizabeth said bluntly. "It should come back to you." She went back to her sewing. "Think about it." They waited another 3 hours. When the door finally opened and Nathaniel walked in, Elizabeth read the result in his face before he said a single word. There was tension still. There would be tension for a while yet, but underneath it, something had settled. Something had moved in the right direction. He sat down. Mrs. Hollis appeared with coffee without being asked, because Mrs. Hollis was extraordinary. "The senator agreed," Nathaniel said. The room exhaled. "Thomas is to have no legal authority over Clara's affairs effective immediately. The marriage contract is null and void. The 8,000 goes back to the Whitmore estate." He paused. "And Senator Beaumont will quietly, privately, without public acknowledgement, arrange for Thomas to spend an extended period at the family property in Virginia, away from Kentucky, away from Clara." It was not enough. They all knew it wasn't enough. The knowledge sat in the room with them, uncomfortable and real, the way true things sometimes were. "Judge Whitley made it very clear," Nathaniel continued, "that if Thomas returns to Lexington and makes any contact with Clara, or with anyone connected to this matter, the full record goes public. Every document, every account, in front of every judge on the circuit and every newspaper in the state." Jenny had woken up. She was sitting very still. "Is it over?" she asked. "The immediate danger is," Nathaniel said. He looked at her directly. "You are safe, Jenny. Thomas cannot touch your position here, and he has no reason to try. He knows that any action against anyone connected to this would accelerate everything he's trying to avoid. Jenny nodded slowly. She pressed her lips together. Then she said in a very small voice, "I still want to know he actually had to answer for something." The room was quiet. "He did," Elizabeth said. She set down her sewing and looked at Jenny. "He lost $8,000. He lost his standing in this county. He lost the ability to touch his sister's life. He lost the comfortable situation he had built for himself here, and he has been removed from it." She paused. "It's not a jail cell. I know that. I know what it isn't. But a man who has always operated in rooms without witnesses just learned that witnesses exist, that what he does gets written down, that there are people who will stand up and say, 'I saw this, and I will not be quiet about it.'" She looked at Jenny steadily. "That is not nothing." Jenny held her gaze. Then she looked down at her hands. Then she nodded. Nathaniel was watching Elizabeth. She became aware of it the way you become aware of warmth gradually, then all at once. She picked up her sewing. Clara spoke next. "The 8,000, I want it to go toward a school." Everyone looked at her. "A school for girls," she said. Her voice was very steady. "Languages, reading, figures, the things they don't get taught because nobody thinks they'll need them." She looked at Nathaniel. "I know it's your money technically, but I'm asking." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "It was never my money," he said. "It was payment for something that should never have been a transaction. Do what you want with it." Clara breathed out. "Thank you. Thank Miss Carter," he said. "It was her idea." "It was my suggestion," Elizabeth said. "It was your decision." Clara looked between them with an expression that was half exasperated and half something that might have been fond. "Do you two always do that?" she said. "Do what?" Elizabeth and Nathaniel said at the same time, in almost identical tones of genuine puzzlement. Clara shook her head. But for the first time in weeks, she was almost smiling. The days that followed had the quality of something unwinding. Not the dramatic unwinding of a crisis resolved, but the slow, gradual loosening of tension that had been held in the body so long it had become invisible until it began to ease. Thomas Beaumont left Lexington by Friday. Nathaniel heard it from Graves, who heard it from a contact at the coaching office. No ceremony, no farewells. A carriage, a trunk, a man who left as quietly as a man who had made a great deal of noise could manage. Elizabeth stood at her workroom window Friday afternoon and thought good. Then she went back to the aunt's gown. On Saturday she finished it. Both gowns, the first she had completed the week before, the second now done, pressed, wrapped in cloth, ready for delivery. She laid them out and looked at them with the satisfaction of work completed well, which was a specific and underrated kind of satisfaction. She was writing up the invoice when Nathaniel knocked at her workroom door. She had started leaving it unlocked when she was in 3 days ago. She had not examined this choice closely. He came in and she handed him the invoice, and he looked at it and looked at the gowns and said, "My aunt is going to be very pleased." "Your aunt has excellent taste," Elizabeth said. "She specified exactly what she wanted, which makes my job considerably easier." He folded the invoice, put it in his coat pocket, stood in the middle of her workroom, looking slightly at a loss, which was not his usual bearing. "Nathaniel," she said. "I want to offer you something," he said. "And I want to offer it correctly, which means I need to be very clear about what it is and what it isn't." She put down her pen. He looked at her steadily. "There is a property on the east side of Lexington. Belongs to the Whitmore estate, been empty for 2 years. It's a proper commercial building. Ground floor large enough for a real workroom space for 3 or 4 seamstresses working at once. The kind of space where you could take on apprentices and commissions you actually want, not commissions you have to take." He stopped. "I want to offer you the use of it, at a fair market rent. Nothing below fair market. I am not offering you charity, and I know you wouldn't take it if I were." Elizabeth was very still. "I'm offering you a business opportunity," he said. "Because you are the finest seamstress in this county, and you have been working in a room the size of a closet, and you have earned something larger." A pause. "That's all it is." If you'd rather find your own building in your own time, I understand completely. I'm not attaching anything to this. She looked at him. Are you attaching anything to this? She asked. No, he said. This stands alone. He met her eyes. What else I want to say to you stands separately. And I'm not going to say it while I'm offering you a building, because I will not have you wondering which one you're responding to. Elizabeth looked at him for a long time. How much is fair market rent on that building? She said finally. He told her. She ran the numbers in her head quickly. The way she always ran numbers. The way she had been running numbers since she was 12 years old, keeping her mother's accounts. It was genuinely fair market. She checked it twice. It was not a favor disguised as a transaction. It was what the building was worth. I'd want to see it, she said. Of course. And I'd want my own lease, my name on it, my terms. I would expect nothing less, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The workroom was very quiet around them, all the fabric and thread and the small careful tools of her trade, the life she had built, stitch by careful stitch. All right, she said. I'll see the building. He nodded. And then, and this was the thing she was not prepared for, he simply stood there for another moment, with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that was not the collected, deliberate expression of Nathaniel Whitmore managing a situation. It was just a man standing in a small workroom, looking at a woman he admired and did not know what to do with, which was perhaps the most honest she had ever seen him. You said the other thing stands separately, she said. It does. I'm not stopping you from saying it. He was quiet for a moment. Not yet, he said. Not until the building is settled and the rent is signed, and there is absolutely nothing between what I say and what you hear it as, except what it actually is. Elizabeth looked at him. She thought this man is going to be the end of all my careful sense. She said, Fine, go arrange the lease. He put his hat on, went to the door. Lizzie, he said. She looked up. Thank you, he said. For all of it. For what you were willing to risk. He held her gaze. I know what it cost. She held his gaze in return. I know what it was worth, she said quietly. He nodded once, and he left. She sat for a moment in the quiet he left behind. Then she picked up her pen. Then she put it down again. She sat there for a little while longer than was strictly necessary. Then she picked the pen back up, and she wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, and she thought, Write it down, Lizzie. So she did. The lease was signed on a Tuesday. Elizabeth Carter stood in the empty building on the east side of Lexington with a pen in her hand and Aldous Marsh's notarized document on the table in front of her, and she read every line of it twice before she signed. She had made 3 amendments during the negotiation. Marsh had brought the first draft to her workroom, and she had read it at her sewing table and sent it back with corrections written in her own hand, in the margins neat and specific and non-negotiable. Marsh had looked at her corrections with the expression of a man encountering something mildly unprecedented. Miss Carter, he had said carefully, these are thorough. The rent escalation clause in paragraph 4 assumes a fixed client base. Elizabeth had said without looking up from her work. I intend to expand. I need flexibility in the 3rd year. And the maintenance responsibility in paragraph 7 is ambiguous. I want it clarified before I sign anything. Marsh had taken the amended draft back to Nathaniel. Nathaniel had signed off on all 3 changes without comment. Marsh had reported this with the same slightly bemused expression. So now the lease was signed. Elizabeth's name was on it. Her terms, her building. She put the pen down and looked at the space around her, and let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds, the size of it, the possibility of it, the particular sensation of standing inside something that was entirely hers, and then she picked up her measuring tape and started planning where the cutting tables would go. Nathaniel was there. He had attended the signing, which was appropriate, and he had stayed after Marsh left, which was something she had not objected to. He stood near the window with his arms folded and watched her move through the space with her tape measure and did not say anything because he had learned when to be quiet, which was one of the things she appreciated most about him. 3 tables along this wall, she said, not really to him, mostly thinking aloud. Natural light from the north windows for color work. Storage in the back corner. I'll need to build a fitting partition, not a room, just a screen, something that can move. I can have someone here Thursday, he said. I'll hire my own carpenter, she said. A brief pause. All right. She turned. He was looking at her with that expression, the layered one, the complicated one that she had spent 4 weeks carefully not examining too closely because she had 12 other things to examine first. The 12 things were resolved. The building was signed. There was nothing between them now except what was actually there. Nathaniel, she said. Lizzie, he said. They spoke simultaneously, and then both stopped. She almost smiled. He did smile, brief, warm, the real version of the expression she had seen him work toward for weeks. You first, he said. She looked at him steadily. I need to say something before you say what I think you're going to say, and I need you to hear it as what it is, not as a refusal. He nodded, waited. I have spent the last 4 weeks watching you, she said. I've watched how you listen, how you use information, what you do when you're angry, and what you do when you're frightened, and what you do when someone less powerful than you needs something. She paused. And I know my own mind. I know what I feel. She held his gaze. But I will not become a smaller version of myself in order to fit into your life. I will not give up this building or this work or anything I've built because it's inconvenient, or because society has opinions about seamstresses and landowners. I have worked too long and too hard, and the work matters too much. I know that, he said. I need you to know it in the specific sense, she said. Not in the general sense of a man who respects a woman's industry in the abstract. In the specific sense of, I will take commissions from people you find difficult. I will have opinions about your affairs that you have not asked for. I will keep my own records and make my own decisions, and there will be mornings when I am at that cutting table before you are awake, and evenings when I am still there after you've gone to bed. He looked at her. Is that a warning? He said. It's a description, she said, of what I actually am. He was quiet for a moment, not uncertain thinking. The specific, deliberate thinking she recognized by now. Can I tell you what I actually want? He said. Yes, she said. I want someone who tells me the truth, he said. I spent 3 years in a courtship with a woman who couldn't tell me the truth. Not because she was dishonest, but because she was trapped, and I was too comfortable to notice. I want someone who notices when something is wrong and says so. I want someone whose opinion of what I'm doing means something because she's paying actual attention and not just being agreeable. He paused. I want someone who keeps a ledger and reads every line of a lease before she signs it, because that is the kind of mind I want in the room when I'm making decisions. Elizabeth looked at him. I am not describing someone convenient, he continued. I'm describing you, specifically. He held her gaze. The work stays. The building stays. Your name on the lease stays. All of it stays. I am not asking you to fit into my life. I'm asking whether there is any version of this where our lives fit together. The empty building was very quiet around them. Outside, Lexington was going about its Tuesday business, entirely indifferent to two people standing in an unsigned future and deciding what to do with it. Ask me again in 6 months, Elizabeth said. He blinked. 6 months. I need to open this workroom, she said. Hire the apprentices, build the client base properly. I need to know who I am in this building before I decide what else I am. She looked at him directly. 6 months. Ask me again then. He held her gaze for a long moment. All right, he said. 6 months. In the meantime, she said, I am not unavailable for conversation. Something shifted in his face. Conversation. And possibly Sunday dinners, she said. If Mrs. Hollis is cooking because I have yet to find fault with anything she's produced. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been handed something he had been careful not to hope for. Sunday dinners, he said. I'll let Mrs. Hollis know. Good, Elizabeth said, and turned back to her measuring tape. She heard him exhale behind her, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something between the two. Lizzie, he said. The north wall, she said. I need you to hold the other end of this tape." He crossed the room and took the end of the tape. And that was how it began. Not with a declaration, not with drama, with a measuring tape, and a Tuesday morning, and two people deciding to occupy the same space and see what happened. 6 weeks later, Clara Beaumont's school opened. It was not a grand opening. There was no ceremony, no announcement in the Lexington Gazette, no formal gathering of influential families. There was a room above a dry goods store on Main Street, rented with money from the dissolved marriage contract, with 4 second-hand chairs and 2 tables and a small chalkboard and a sign on the door that said, "Carter Beaumont Academy for Girls Reading Figures and Languages, Inquire Within." Elizabeth had insisted her name not be on the sign. Clara had insisted it be there. They had argued about it for 2 days, which was how they argued about most things directly, completely with no hard feelings afterward, because they were too similar to hold grudges about differences of opinion. Clara had won. Elizabeth's name was on the sign, which Elizabeth maintained was unnecessary, and Clara maintained was accurate. The first day, 3 girls came, ages 8, 10, and 14. The 8-year-old could not read a word. The 14-year-old could read, but had never been taught figures, and believed, as she said very earnestly on that first morning, that numbers were for men and bookkeepers. "What is a bookkeeper?" Clara asked her. "Someone who keeps books," the girl said. "And could a woman keep books?" The girl thought about it. "I reckon she could if someone taught her." "Then let's start there," Clara said. Elizabeth heard this account from Clara that evening and felt something settle in her chest. Something that had been waiting to settle for a long time. Jenny, meanwhile, had become something unexpected. She had come to Whitmore House as a housemaid, and within 3 weeks had quietly reorganized Mrs. Hollis's entire linen inventory system in a way that saved the household 4 hours a week. Mrs. Hollis had looked at the new system, then looked at Jenny and said, "Child, who taught you to do this?" "Nobody," Jenny had said. "I just thought about how it could work better." Mrs. Hollis had promoted her on the spot, not to a formal title, because formal titles were not how Mrs. Hollis operated, but to a practical authority over the household's organizational matters that everyone, including Graves, silently acknowledged within a fortnight. Nathaniel heard about this from Graves, who reported it with the tone of a man who had opinions about the reorganization of the linen inventory, but had the wisdom to keep them private. He told Elizabeth on Sunday. She listened, and then she said, "Jenny is going to run something someday." "She's running something now," Nathaniel said. "Ask Graves." Elizabeth smiled. She was sitting across from him at the Whitmore House dining table with the remains of Sunday dinner, between them and Mrs. Hollis's excellent apple cake on a plate she was working through with dedication. The Sunday dinners had become a fixture. Nathaniel, Elizabeth, and increasingly Clara, when she came in from town, and occasionally Agnes Fowler, when she visited from Versailles, because Agnes and Mrs. Hollis had formed the kind of immediate friendship that competent women form when they recognize each other. It was, Elizabeth thought, a very good table to sit at. She had not told Nathaniel that. She had thought it, though, privately, frequently, and with increasing emphasis. On a Thursday morning in February, 2 months after the lease was signed, Elizabeth arrived at the new workroom to find both her apprentices already there. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the third person in the room. She was perhaps 16 thin, in a dress that was mended at both elbows, holding a small bundle of cloth samples in front of her like a shield. "She was waiting outside when we got here," said her apprentice Dora, a sharp 14-year-old who had come to Elizabeth through Clara's school and showed a natural gift for cut and line. Elizabeth looked at the girl. "Can I help you?" "I heard you take apprentices," the girl said. Her chin was up, but her hands weren't quite steady. "I want to learn to sew. I already know some my grandmother taught me before she died, but I want to learn properly." She met Elizabeth's eyes. "I can't pay, but I'll work hard. I'll work harder than anyone." Elizabeth looked at her for a moment. She looked at the cloth samples brought because the girl knew enough to know that showing what you could do mattered more than what you could say. "Show me your stitches," Elizabeth said. The girl unwrapped the cloth samples with hands that shook slightly. The stitches were uneven. Inconsistent tension. Several places where she'd corrected herself mid-line. But the correction instinct was right, She knew when something was wrong, which was not teachable. "What's your name?" Elizabeth said. "Ruth," the girl said. "Ruth Simmons." "How far do you live from here, Ruth?" "3 streets. Be here at 7 tomorrow morning," Elizabeth said. "You'll earn your training by working 3 afternoons a week. The other mornings, you'll be at Miss Beaumont's school on Main Street, because I will not take on an apprentice who can't do figures. Do you understand?" Ruth stared at her. "I can come." 7 in the morning, Elizabeth said. "Not 7:15, 7. Ruth clutched her cloth samples to her chest with both arms. Her eyes were very bright. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "Thank you, ma'am." Elizabeth was already moving toward her cutting table. "Don't thank me. Come ready to work." But she did not look up from her table until she heard the door close, and when she was certain she was facing away from both apprentices, she allowed herself one moment of the very specific feeling that comes from doing something your mother would have been proud of. Then she picked up her shears and got to work. On the Sunday before the 6 months were up, Nathaniel asked her to walk with him after dinner. They walked along the road behind Whitmore House in the early spring cold, which was the kind of cold that had lost its conviction and was mostly performance at this point. There were green things coming up in the verges. Elizabeth noticed them in the way she noticed everything, not dramatically, just cleanly filed away. They had been walking for perhaps 15 minutes, talking about nothing in particular. Clara's school had 8 students now. Agnes was thinking of closing her shop in Versailles and moving to Lexington. Judge Whitley had sent a letter reporting that Thomas Beaumont remained in Virginia and showed no signs of testing the arrangement when Nathaniel said, "It's been 6 months." Elizabeth kept walking. "I know. I said I'd ask again in 6 months." "You did." "I'm asking." She walked 3 more steps, then she stopped. She turned and looked at him in the late afternoon light. This man who had been sitting in the mud outside a church in November and was now standing in a road in April, looking at her with the expression of someone who has been patient in the specific sustained way that costs something. And she thought about everything she had been building for 6 months. The workroom, the apprentices, Ruth's uneven stitches, correcting themselves week by week, Clara's school, Jenny's reorganized linen inventory. The ledger she still kept the commissions she chose for herself, and she thought, "I know who I am in that building." "I have one condition," she said. He waited. "My name stays Carter," she said. "Professionally. On the sign. In the accounts. Whatever I build, it builds under that name." "Of course," he said, as if the alternative had never occurred to him. She looked at him. "And I will tell you when I think you're wrong," she said. "I'd be concerned if you stopped," he said. "And Sunday dinners stay at Whitmore House because Mrs. Hollis is a better cook than I am, and I see no reason to change what isn't broken." He almost laughed. The real laugh, the one she had been cataloging since the church path, the one that arrived rarely and completely and changed his whole face. "Agreed," he said. "And," she stopped herself. "And," he said. She looked at him with the look she gave numbers. She was checking, direct, precise, taking in the whole thing. "And nothing," she said. "I think that covers it." He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had done so. Which was, she noted privately, the correct first gesture for this particular man, in this particular moment. Not dramatic, not performed, just a hand reaching for hers. She let him take it. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That's a yes," she said. They stood in the road in the April cold for a moment. His hand was warm. Hers was not as usual. She was always cold, which she attributed to poor circulation and years of working near drafty windows. He did not comment on the temperature of her hand. He just held it. "You know," he said, "I have thought approximately every day for 6 months about the fact that you held a stranger's hand in the mud outside a church and changed everything." "I held your shoulder," she said. "Not your hand. You should remember correctly." "You're right," he said. "I stand corrected." "You were sitting," she said. He looked at her. "Lizzie." "Yes." "Stop talking for a moment." She considered this. "All right," she said. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead. Careful, deliberate, exactly the right amount of everything. And she stood very still and let the feeling of it move through her without cataloging it, which was something she allowed herself only rarely. Then she straightened. "Now I want to talk again," she said. "I assumed," he said. She turned, and they began walking back toward the house, his hand still holding hers, and she thought about the morning in November when she had set her wooden box against a church wall and crossed a wet stone path and knelt in the mud beside a man she didn't know. She thought about what she had told Agnes Fowler. "We notice things. It's the job." And she thought about her ledger. All those entries, all those dates and times, and careful observations. The whole long record of a winter and a spring, spent watching and writing and refusing to look away. She had written down everything except the most important thing. The thing that had been growing in the margin of every page since she first looked at Nathaniel Whitmore's white-knuckled hands and made a decision. She thought about writing it down tonight. Just the date and a single line. She thought her mother would appreciate that. They came back to Whitmore House, and the windows were warm, and Mrs. Hollis had left the lamp burning in the entrance hall the way she always did when she expected people back, and Clara was in the sitting room with a book and her feet tucked under her on the chair in a way that Senator Beaumont would have found improper, and that Elizabeth found entirely correct. Clara looked up when they came in. She looked at their hands. She looked at their faces. She went back to her book. "About time," she said. Elizabeth took off her cloak. "Mind your own affairs, Clara." "I have 8 students and a school to run," Clara said. "I'm minding them. This is recreation." Nathaniel was making a sound that was very specifically not a laugh. "You are both the most trying people I have ever encountered," Elizabeth said. "And yet," Clara said from behind her book, "here you are." Here she was. Elizabeth Carter, daughter of a carpenter and a seamstress, owner of the Carter Workroom on the east side of Lexington. Keeper of records, trainer of apprentices. The woman who had given Ruth Simmons a starting place, and Jenny Marsh a safe one. And Clara Beaumont, the particular courage that comes from being told by someone with nothing to gain that you were not what your brother said you were. The woman who had knelt in the mud outside a church on a November morning and held a stranger's grief with both arms, and had not walked away when it would have been easier, and had not been quiet when silence would have been safer, and had not made herself smaller to fit inside someone else's story. She had written her own. She went to sit by the fire. Nathaniel sat across from her, and Clara had her book, and the lamp made its warm circle around the 3 of them, and Mrs. Hollis brought in tea without being asked, because Mrs. Hollis was a force of nature in human form, and outside the April evening was cool and full of things coming back to life. Elizabeth picked up the cup, held it with both hands the way she always did, warming them through. She thought about her mother, who had taught her to keep records and to finish one thing when the world was falling apart, and then find the next thing. Who had told her write it down. "Lizzie, they can take everything else, but not what you witnessed." She had witnessed a great deal this winter. She reached into her pocket. Her ledger was there. It was always there. She opened it to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote in her careful, even hand, "Today everything was what it should be." She closed the ledger. She put it back in her pocket. She picked up her tea. And Elizabeth, seamstress record keeper, the woman who had stopped when everyone else had walked past, sat in the warm circle of the lamplight and knew exactly who she was and exactly what she had built and exactly where she belonged. She had not needed saving. She had arrived here by her own hand, one careful stitch at a time, and that was the truest thing about her. The thing. The ledger held. The thing. The building carried the thing. Ruth Simmons would one day understand when she was the one standing at the cutting table with a girl in a mended dress at her door. A woman who knows her worth doesn't wait for the world to confirm it. She writes it down herself, and she doesn't stop writing